Welcome to Introduction to Horticulture. What you're seeing here is a picture of some of our past students while they were working at the Santa Barbara High School greenhouse a few years ago before it was remodeled. And they were taking this course, EH110, as a dual enrollment course. And as you can see, it's just always fun. So this course is meant to be an overview of all the other courses, or most of the other courses in our department. We'll spend 1 to 2 weeks on a number of topics like plant propagation, restoration, landscape maintenance, irrigation, and a few others. In this course, we'll just spend 1 to 2 weeks on those topics, but most of those courses also have their own 16-week full course devoted to that particular subject. You can take a full 16-week course in just in irrigation, or permaculture, soils, etc. So that's why we call it the intro course. You don't have to take this course first, but if you're trying to check out more about the field of horticulture and the department, this is the place to start. This is a picture of a past restoration class. It's EH112 or EH113. And this is quite a while ago. This is about 15 years ago. And the teachers are in the front center there under that yucca stalk. And they're showing you a restoration site. This is on campus, the area that's near the stadium. This was a dirt slope. They got a grant from the San Ynez Band, Chumash, and they restored native plants to that slope. So that's just part of the class. A lot of fun, a lot of hands-on. Same class, Ecological Restoration class. When we're able to take field trips, they do it every single class. They do at least 2 field trips, and one is an overnighter to the Channel Islands. And here you're seeing a picture of them doing some restoration. They're taking water and propagated native plants out to a rock called Scorpion Rock, which is just off of Scorpion Harbor on Santa Cruz Island, where they were doing some restoration. This is a collage of pictures of the students constructing and utilizing a shade structure on Santa Cruz Island for propagating native plants out there for restoration out there, all done within the horticulture class, EH112 and EH113. Another one of our classes that we'll touch on in this class, but you can go into more depth, is our full-length permaculture design course. Here is a class out at Quail Springs Permaculture Farm, a couple hours from here in Cuyama, and we spent the weekend there. This is one of our projects, was building this cob or earthen bench to sit on. We were resurfacing it, actually. And we do also have an advanced permaculture class as well. So you can take 2 full semesters of permaculture. Again, the permaculture class, visiting Quail Springs, this same permaculture farm, and getting to tour one of their natural buildings made of cob. The plant propagation course, which we'll talk about just 1 week in this intro class, in the full-length course, we spend 16 weeks propagating all different kinds of species, a lot of landscape species, some natives, from using a variety of methods. Here's a class field trip to a company in Carpinteria called Everbloom that grows different types of cut flowers. Actually, I should say grew 275 different cultivars of these Gerbera daisies under glass. Now that company and many of them in Carpinteria are not growing cut flowers anymore. They're growing cannabis and hemp. Our Irrigation Technology course covers lots of different types of irrigation systems and design, including hydroponic systems that we describe in class, and you get hands-on experience building these systems. An image of our landscape maintenance course that was refurbishing the planter bed out in front of the Luria Library, taking out all these water greedy plants and putting in drought tolerant or water conserving plants like these succulents and natives. One more image here of these, just some examples of the courses we have that you can take. The soils class, here's a picture of us down in Carpinteria at a bank that wanted their soils tested. So we took some soil cores and we took some soil samples and analyzed them for infiltration, nutrient content, compaction, and a variety of other soil factors to help them determine how to improve their soils around the landscaping of the bank. So we do a lot of hands-on stuff in these classes. So to start with in this class, I want to give you a big picture, describe to you different aspects of ecosystems. So let's look at the ecological aspects of horticulture. Kind of to back up, horticulture deals with the business of plants, and plants are part of the plant kingdom, one of the 6 kingdoms of life. That's a little bit dated. People talk more about domains now, and I'll show you and talk to you about that more in the following slides. But it's just a way for scientists to categorize and organize all the different living species. In this class, we'll talk just about plants, and I wanted also for you to see how plants fit into the greater definition of living things, all the living things on Earth. Kind of a side note, but of interest, and I want you to know about it, is what distinguishes living things from non-living things. Well, all living things can grow and reproduce. They're made up of cells. Living things respond to stimuli. Living things take in energy and metabolize that energy. Living things inherit traits from their parents, and they pass on those traits to the offspring and maintain homeostasis. The last one means that all living things have to maintain some types of physiological characteristics inside their bodies. Like human bodies, we maintain our internal body temperature at 98.6 unless we're sick. We also maintain certain pH levels in the cells, certain levels of hydration, hormone levels, lots of different things like that. All organisms that are alive have some means of maintaining physiological factors like that within their bodies. And back to classification of living things, let's look at the big picture here of how plants fit into the overall scheme of living things. So let's look at a bunch of different categorizations of living things and the systems they live in. Start at the bottom with the individual organism. If you have one individual of a species, in this case a bison, we're looking at the picture, that's just an organism. If you look at all the bison of that same species, so all the same type of species of bison in a defined area, that would be a population. The defined area could be something like the Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve in Kansas. So that Tallgrass Prairie Preserve in Kansas, if you counted all the bison, that would be the population of bison in that preserve. Now, if you looked at all the other plants and animals in that preserve, in this picture showing hawks, snakes, bison, prairie dogs, and grasses, that is considered a community. All the different species or all the different populations of species that live together in a defined area. So that would be the community in the Tallgrass Prairie Preserve. Now, when you add the non-living surroundings of that prairie, in our example, then it's called an ecosystem. So an ecosystem is the community of different species. All the populations of species make a community, and then you add the environment that's not alive, like rocks, soil, water, humidity, minerals, sunlight. That combined with the community is an ecosystem. If you look at large areas of the world with similar plant life and similar climate, those are called biomes. And then the largest category is the biosphere. It's the whole area of the earth, from way up in the atmosphere to down into the soil, that contains living things. The definition of a species, a single organism, is a group of living organisms of similar individuals. Usually they look alike, and they're capable of interbreeding and exchanging genes. The species is the principal taxonomic unit. So it's the kind of like we're looking at bison, it's the smallest, most individual kind of building block of all the ecosystems. and each species has a two-part scientific or Latin name given to it, and that's to distinguish it from all the other species in the world. Humans are Homo sapiens, two-part Latin name. Homo is the genus, sapiens is the species, but our species is known as Homo sapiens. You were talking about a coast live oak tree that grow wild around here. It's Quercus agrifolia, two-part scientific name for each species. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. This slide just lists the different types of things that are involved in an ecosystem. Remember, an ecosystem is the community of different species in an area, plus the non-living things or abiotic factors in that same area. The sun, the light, the heat, the temperature, rocks, soil, water, etc. Both biotic and abiotic, living and non-living factors together make an ecosystem. Ecosystems are often named after the dominant species in them. In the picture you're looking at, this is a redwood forest, named a redwood forest because the redwood trees are the most dominant species there in this plant community. If you took out all those redwood trees, there would still be a lot of other plant species that grew there, but the ecosystem would look vastly different. It would be much drier, a lot more sunlight, and the types of plants that grow there would probably look pretty different too. But that's one reason why we use the dominant species as the way to name that, because it has those dominant species have a large influence on the environment and the ecosystem. Marine ecosystems are also sometimes named for their dominant species. The forest you're looking at is a kelp forest because kelp, Macrocystis, is the largest and most dominant species and most influential in that ecosystem. It is doing a majority of the photosynthesis, creating habitat, blocking light, and has a host of other different species in it, but it is named after kelp. Taxonomy is the science of describing, classifying, and naming organisms, and it's hierarchical, just as we saw when we looked at organisms make up populations, populations make up communities, communities in the environment make up ecosystems. That's what would be called a hierarchical system, like nested. Bigger categories have a number of small ones fitting within them, and each of those has another number of smaller ones fitting within them. That's what hierarchical means. All living things are categorized into one of three domains of life: bacterial domain, the archaea domain, and the eukaryota domain. Bacterial domain involves what you probably know most as bacteria. A lot of them are human pathogens, but a lot of them are also things like probiotics, have lots of great bacteria in them that are healthy and helpful for humans. Eukaryota are all the other living things that we can see and interact with a little bit more. Can't see all of them, but like algae, also plants, animals, fungi, etc. So the eukaryota are kind of the more well-known of the species in that domain. The archaea are bacteria-like organisms, but they live in extreme environments, high salt or high salinity environments, or very hot environments, very deep or high levels of sulfides or chemicals. They're able to exist in those areas. They actually genetically have less in common with bacteria than humans do with bacteria. So they have their own domain. Plants within the plant category, or sometimes referred to as a kingdom, we have 5 different categories. There are non-vascular seedless plants. There are vascular seedless plants. There are vascular plants that produce seeds in cones. There are vascular plants that produce seeds in flowers, where the plants have leaf veins that are parallel and other characteristics. And there are vascular plants that produce seeds in flowers where the leaf veins are branched and a few other characteristics. Vascular is the system of pipes inside a plant's body that moves sugars and water and nutrients around. loosely analogous to our cardiovascular system, our arteries and veins. So for example, mosses do not have a vascular system. Water gets absorbed into the outer layer of cells and it has to be transported through the moss's plant body, just going from cell to cell, slowly diffusing from one cell to the next. When you get to ferns, those have a vascular system, a system of pipes that can move the water and the nutrients and sugars around much more rapidly inside the plant, thus allowing those plants to get bigger. Although ferns have a vascular system, they do not produce seeds. They produce what are called spores that are much more rudimentary. Another category are the gymnosperms, or conifers, pines, plants that produce seeds, true seeds, not spores, but they produce them in cones. They do have vascular systems, but their seeds are produced in cones. The fourth category, plants that have a vascular system and produce their seeds in flowers. And of that group, plants that have vascular system and produce flowers with seeds, there are two groups, subgroups within that. One's called a monocot. That's where the leaf veins are parallel, the seed only has one part, and the petals are in threes, multiples of three. Those are monocots. Look, think about a rice plant. So the rice grain itself is just one part, or a corn kernel only has one part to it. Those are monocots. The fifth category are plants that have a vascular system, produce their seeds in flowers, but the veins, the patterning of the veins on the leaves is branched, not parallel, and the seeds have two parts. For example, a bean seed or a peanut has two parts that kind of come apart when you look at them. Those would be a dicot, sometimes called eudicot. So those are the 5 categories of plants. An example of a non-vascular seedless plant, a moss, and one of the reasons that these are so small is because they do not have a vascular system and they can't move the water and sugars around in their body very far. So they just can't get that big. Liverworts are also a non-vascular seedless plant. And these are things you probably have never seen that grow in really wet areas on the forest floor. Ferns, an example of a plant that does not produce seeds. It produces spores, but it does have a vascular system, so they get larger. Some ferns get really large, like the tree ferns can get 30 feet tall. And gymnosperms, these are the plants that have a vascular system. They do produce seeds, but their seeds are all produced in cones. What you're looking at here is a pine tree, and you're seeing the female cones on the right, the green one and the brown one, and then the male cones on the left, the yellow ones that produce a lot of pollen. They're all cones. This makes them gymnosperms. And just one example of what we call angiosperms, and these are plants that produce seeds and flowers, and they also have a vascular system. So they're not producing cones to make seeds, they're producing flowers. This is a strawberry plant. This slide just lists a few other common California plant families that I recommend getting to know. Sunflower family, mustard family, carrot family, legume family, grass family. There's a few others too, but if you learn the common characteristics of those families' flowers, you can point them out pretty quickly. You could come across a plant hiking and not know what it is, but know, oh, that looks like it's in the carrot family, and then that really helps you narrow down what the species might be. Within the plant grouping or kingdom, the family is an important category. If you know the plant's family, it can really help you identify it. So it depends on which species you're looking at. Sometimes if you were dealing with insects, the class and the order would be important. But within plants, family characteristics it's the category that kind of holds together the best. Plants, let's say, for example, the sunflower family. All the plants, there's thousands of different species in the sunflower family, but they all tend to have similar flower shape or morphology, and that helps you narrow down what plant it is when you're identifying it by being able to figure out the family. So that's the important category within the plant kingdom, is family. Let's look at the scientific name. So as I said a few slides back, scientific name is binomial. It has two parts. The first part is the genus. The second part is called the species, or the specific epithet, which is more than you want to know. Big leaf maple is a maple tree that is native to California, the higher elevations, especially our coastal ranges. The genus is Acer, and the species is Macrophyllum, which just means big leaf in Latin. But if you were walking through the woods and you knew this plant, you could identify it, and someone pointed, you were walking with someone and they said, "What's that tree there?" And they pointed to a big leaf maple. You would say, that species is Acer macrophyllum. It's two-part, Acer macrophyllum, just like humans are Homo sapiens. So that's the species name, involves two parts. Other plants in that Acer genus are all maples, but they're different kinds of maples, maybe black maple or silver maple, and they would have a different species or second part of that name. Here's a couple of other examples. I used to live in the Midwest, so these are more Midwestern examples, but oak tree Latin names: Quercus fellows is willow oak, Quercus rubra, red oak. Around here we've got Quercus agrifolia, coast live oak. Over in the valley, like San Ynez, Quercus lobata is valley oak. Those are some examples of Latin binomial scientific names. Common names can be used for plants as well, besides the scientific name, but they can get confusing because if you travel at all, what is a common name for a plant in one area might have the same common name for a different species in a different area. For example, around here we have a flower called canyon sunflower, and that it has a certain scientific name attached to it around here in Southern California. But if you went to northern parts of Mexico, they also have plants that are called the same thing, canyon sunflower, that relate to a completely different species. Episote is a common name used for a number of different species, depending on different locations that you might be at, different geographic areas. So the scientific names is the only one that's all over the world. All the scientists have agreed every species gets assigned a two-part scientific name for only that particular species. And that is agreed upon, a common language throughout the scientific world, all over the world. Whereas with common names, it's just things that lay people come up with, naming plants, and so sometimes those can be repetitive and confusing. A cultivar is a shortened word for the phrase cultivated variety, and it just means a type of a plant that's created and maintained by humans, usually maintained by cloning. Cultivars can't reproduce without their genetics changing. So imagine an orchard of Honeycrisp apples. Those are cultivars that produce that really yummy, sweet, big, crisp apple or fruit. If those were not maintained by humans, that orchard, those trees would over time, within a few decades, die off, but their seeds would fall, and those seeds would grow up, and the new orchard replacing those Honeycrisps, they would not be the same at all. They would produce very different fruit because the seeds underwent genetic recombination to be created, and the trees would be completely different. So that cultivar would not be maintained on its own. It's humans that they would take cuttings of those trees and clone them to make sure the genetics stayed the same. Whenever seeds are produced, the genetics change quite a bit. For example, like you can't take an avocado pit, an avocado you bought at the store, and grow it. You can put it in water and let it sprout and plant it in the ground, and it'll grow up, but the avocados will have not be the same as the one you bought and ate. They very likely will not be a good Hass or bacon, avocado, or whatever it was that you bought, because those are propagated through cloning, not through seed production where the genetics change. So that's why cultivars need humans to maintain them. Well, hopefully you can tell the difference between plants and animals, but here's some technical differences between the two. Animals can move, they're mobile, plants cannot. I think you probably knew that. Animals have a nervous system and plants do not in the same way at all. Plants can respond to chemicals and light, temperature, but they don't have what we call a nervous system. Both can reproduce or self-replicate. Animals need to ingest food. Plants make their own. Just a few differences. A couple of other species that are not plants, but that are considered part of the horticulture industry. Yeast, very important in our culture for producing any alcoholic beverages, for bread making, cheese making, very big in the industry. And it's loosely considered part of horticulture. Mushrooms or fungi are also part of the horticulture world. People that grow mushrooms and things are kind of considered within the bounds of the horticulture industry. Whew, we made it through the first section of the first lecture. This slide here is just for fun, give you a little breather, stop the brain from having to learn and store new information. If you want to take a little break and watch the video, there's the videos of the 10 most expensive fruits produced in the world. And you can look at all of this video or a part of it just to have fun and see some of the crazy fruits and how expensive they are. Some fruits that are produced are worth thousands of dollars each. So check that out just for a break. And when you're ready, go on to the next slide and we'll finish this lecture talking about the scientific method. So I'm going to describe the scientific method to you. It's part of this course, and it's also potentially something you'll need to know about in your individual project that you'll be working on and that's due at the end of the semester. I'll talk more about that later. There are different ways of learning and knowing about our world as humans, maybe other creatures as well. Language is one way we can learn about it, the way you're learning about it now, visually and by hearing me describe things. We can learn about our world and perceive it through emotions, reasoning, sometimes imagination, using our senses. Sometimes faith can tell us about the world, intuition, memory. So these are lots of ways of knowing. One way of knowing about the world is the Western culture's scientific method. It seems to be held up very high as the ultimate way of knowing. You know, if research confirms something, then it must be true. But I just wanted to put it into context that there are lots of ways of knowing. So the scientific method uses mostly our senses, what we can observe and measure is what we can use as our data to draw conclusions about the world from. That's the scientific method. Another way to describe the scientific method is it's science based on observation, perceiving objects, events, dynamics, and by using one of the 5 senses. Often it's, we have instruments to measure things, length, volume, speed, all kinds of measurements that are taken. Observations at first, they could be informal too. Someone could, scientists could be walking through the woods and say, I wonder why there are so many small trees around the rocks that I see out here in the woods. That's an observation that might lead them to develop a hypothesis. So now we're talking about the scientific process. First, observations are made. Second, questions are formed from those observations. Oh, I see a lot of smaller, younger trees around the rocks. In this forest, they might say to themselves. And then they might form a question, why are the younger class of tree ages more concentrated around rocks in the forest? A hypothesis could then be formed, And that would be when you start the hypothesis, it's for doing formal scientific work. You could form a hypothesis that the smaller trees are gathered around the rocks that are found in the woods due to higher levels of moisture around those rocks from shading. And then you would run an experiment. You would look, you'd measure and take samples and observe a larger area of the forest and compare the ages of the trees and the number of rocks and their proximity to the rocks and the soil moisture. And you get some data, and maybe that data did show that the soil is moister around the rocks, and that's why you're getting more small trees germinating there. And your conclusion would be, our evidence that was gathered, the results support the hypothesis that the small trees are near rocks because the soil is moister there. In scientific method, you can't prove anything. There's no proof. There's just gathering evidence that supports a hypothesis. More on the hypothesis. It's a testable statement that can be supported or not supported by the experimental results. For another example would be plants grow taller when given Miracle-Gro fertilizer. And that would be your hypothesis, and then it could be tested. And we're going to use that example in the next few slides. To test that hypothesis, you could develop an experiment. You have a group of plants. They're all the same species. They're all the same age. They're in the same soil, the same amount of sun and watering. You're making everything the same between these two groups of plants except one factor. And that would be some receive Miracle-Gro and some of those plants don't. So the control group receives no treatment. It's used to compare it to the experimental group that would receive a treatment. So the experimental group of plants would receive the Miracle-Gro and the control group would not. So, and everything else about the two groups, all the variables except the factor you're testing must remain exactly the same. Because if they didn't, then you wouldn't know at the end of the experiment, if you see the Miracle-Gro plants are taller, you wouldn't know if it was because of the Miracle-Gro or perhaps those were all placed closer to the window, the light, or they got more water, or their soil was better, or the plants were even older. So everything has to be the same between those two groups. One thing that's easy to get confused on, so, and I won't ask you a lot about this, but in exams, but are the variables. There's an independent variable and the dependent variable. The independent variable is the factor you change, what you do to your experimental group. So the Miracle-Gro group. That's the independent variable. That's the thing you're adding to that group to see if it has a different effect. The dependent variable is what happens as a result of that treatment. So the dependent variable might be the height of the plant, and that is what you are measuring to see that is an effect of that treatment. The data is collected from the experiment. In this experiment, the experimental group, the treatment group, got Miracle-Gro. The other plants did not. You grew them up for a couple of weeks here in our pretend experiment, and we see that the plants that received the Miracle-Gro, plant A, in this very simple example, we only had one plant in the treatment experimental group, that was plant A, and plant B was the one that was in the control group. It did not receive Miracle-Gro. So you see in this 2-week experiment, plant A received Miracle-Gro and it got to 25 centimeters tall. Plant B did not receive Miracle-Gro and after 2 weeks got to 11 centimeters tall. So it is shorter. This would not be a very robust experiment, but just keeping it very, very simple. So that's how it works. And you would compare those two and you can say, well, our hypothesis was supported by the fact that the plant that received Miracle-Gro, plant A, did get taller than the plant that did not receive it, plant B. So the conclusions of an experiment done with a scientific method would say the hypothesis was supported or it was refuted based on the data. So again, be careful. Scientists usually don't use the word prove because there are no absolutes in science. We can't say that now we know for sure that Miracle-Gro makes plants grow taller. Technically, all you can say is that our evidence supports the hypothesis that Miracle-Gro makes plants grow taller in this situation with these species and within the parameters of the experiment that we developed. That's why when you read things, you will. Another good reason that this is important to know the scientific method is more and more you hear on the radio or you read in articles about like the efficacy of drugs, different pharmaceuticals, what causes cancer or heart attacks. There's a lot of information out there, and it often in kind of the layperson's media, if it's not really scientific language, they will often say things like, it's been shown that eating chocolate every day lowers your risk of heart attack, or drinking a glass of wine will help clear your arteries, or all these things like that. And you have to think about it with some discernment, that if these were true studies that were done to look at the effects of eating chocolate every day on cholesterol levels, then you'd have to look at the actual experiment, and the experiment would never have claimed, now we know that these things are related and you should eat chocolate every day. It'll just say that in this one experiment, with these people in this situation, they saw that cholesterol levels were significantly reduced from people that ate chocolate every day. So it applies to a very narrow situation. And often the media will take it and globalize it and use it as a marketing technique. So be careful when you're especially dealing with healthcare things, that you really think about the scientific method, what it can say and what it can't say. When it comes to really big environmental problems or ecological issues like climate change, global warming, scientific method falls really pretty short in trying to be able to handle these multifactorial, very complex ecological dynamics. So science usually requires very narrow hypotheses and questions, and it deals with narrow specific situations, and that's what the conclusions or results relate to. So if you have a lot of research done using similar hypotheses, and there's wide acceptance and similar results between all those experiments, then that hypothesis can be elevated to a theory. So let's take, for example, the theory of evolution. Evolution is a theory. No one knows for sure that the living creatures we have today are here solely because of the evolutionary process. No one has been around for the last 2 billion years to just watch things change over Earth, so we can't know for sure. But a theory is so widely accepted, and there is so much evidence supporting it by multidisciplinary evidence, that most people accept it as the probable truth. So no absolute proof in science, but some things, if there's enough evidence and enough experiments done, that we can assume it's the truth. That's it for today's lecture.